You want some actual perspective on this? Well, a bit of it comes from the Kansas City-based writer Jason Whitlock, with whom I do not always agree, but who today said it so well that we may as well just quote or paraphrase from the end of his article. Our current gun culture, Whitlock wrote, ensures that more and more domestic disputes will end in the ultimate tragedy, and that more convenience store confrontations over loud music coming from a car will leave more teenage boys bloodied and dead.
That was NBC's Bob Costas at halftime of last night's Cowboys-Eagles game, offering his thoughts on the Javon Belcher tragedy, as well as guns in general after the 25-year-old football player took his own life this weekend, as well as the life of his girlfriend, Cassandra Bell, mother of his 3-month-old child. As you would expect, the murder-suicide has reignited the focus on violence in football, football and drugs, athletes and guns, and, of course, guns and violence. Let's backspin on it. Sorry, I'm actually a little emotional after reading that, but my first thought here is, Bob Costas is in his right to say whatever he wants to say and hold whatever position he wants to hold. And I personally have a pretty nuanced position on this issue in general. I think the NRA, Gun Owners of America, go too far in imposing any kind of restriction on gun rights. They think you should be able to own anything in any number and carry it in any place at any time. And that I disagree with. But what I would say, and let's leave the Constitution out of this because I think that's a complicated argument as well. But what I would say is if you want to infringe on someone's liberty, if you want to say you can't do X or Y or Z, I think the burden of proof has to be on you for why there's a real societal need, a critical societal need for infringing on that liberty. And I've looked into this because I am sort of on the fence on the issue. And I looked back at the 2008 landmark Supreme Court case about the handgun ban in D.C. And Justice Breyer, who actually was a dissenter in the case and who was considered a liberal justice, looked at the evidence for whether a ban on handguns reduces violence and said that the upshot is a set of studies and counter-studies that at most could leave a judge uncertain about the proper policy conclusion. So basically, it's a very mixed bag as to whether totally eliminating guns, restricting guns, actually gets at the problem that we're trying to address.
Guns are only used for one purpose, and that's killing. There's no other way to use them.
My dad uses them for target practice.
Yeah, so do I.
They facilitate, amplify, and escalate anger. They make killing easier. Soldiers talk about it's very close. Killing people when you're close to them takes no courage at all to pull a trigger. So they make us less safer. We have 3,000 kids killed by firearms each year. That's more than the number of soldiers who are killed. One of the things that we didn't quote was Jason Whitlock from Bob Costas, that Jason Whitlock saying handguns don't enhance our safety. They exacerbate our flaws. And that is true. And how many times do we have to hear of a troubled person grabbing a gun and taking their emotions out on somebody else with that gun? Javon Belcher is clearly, a person who had a tremendous amount of pain in his life. He shot his girlfriend 8 times. That is an extraordinary amount of anger spilling out of him. This is not what the founders envisioned, and this is not the best policy that we can have for our society.
Yeah, that anger is what we should be talking about. When we're talking about the weapons, we're not talking about domestic violence. And that does a huge disservice to the woman who is in that situation, who has done no service by Bob Costas, of all people, irresponsibly going out and telling millions of NFL viewers that they have permission to blame guns instead of the person who pulled the trigger. So we're not going to talk about the reason for domestic violence. We're not going to talk about maybe whether or not this guy had psychiatric problems. We're going to talk about the gun. And for Whitlock or Costas to give an inanimate object human capabilities, saying that handguns exacerbate our flaws, tempt us to escalate arguments, and bait us into embracing confrontation is absolutely absurd. And I think that rather than talk about the guns, what we should be talking about is the root of the problem. And Bob Costas has, I think, done something shameful and irresponsible and is going to have some blood on his hands in the future if we continue to talk about the wrong problem, what is not the problem. handguns.
Well, I wish you'd grapple with some of the statistics that are out there, Steve, before you say something like that, because the statistics...
I've written about this a lot, Steve, and very few domestic violence cases are committed with handguns.
Let me share some of the statistics.
That's a fact.
In a house with a gun, a domestic disturbance is 12 times more likely to end in a homicide.
Right.
12 times. A woman living in a house with a gun is 5 times more likely to be murdered.
Right.
2/3 of all women who are killed by guns in this country, and by the way, that's 5 women a day, 2/3 of them are in domestic disturbances. So you don't say it's just about the gun here and we're ignoring domestic violence. There's a link here. A gun plus domestic violence turns what would be a horrible situation where a woman gets beat up but at least has a chance to get out with her life and to get away from that situation. It takes that and it makes her dead. That's what, when you add a gun to that situation, that's what happens.
Most women are in danger in domestic violence situations because of fists and hands. What we need to be looking, anything can be a weapon, Steve. Anything can be a weapon.
But I just established.
But
I just established that
there's the
difference between having the gun in the house and not having the. But there is a 12 times difference between those two things. That's statistically significant.
Let me attempt to mediate this dispute here. I think one thing that, liberals, gun control advocates do need to bear in mind is that there are a lot of very responsible gun owners. My father is one of them. SE is one of them. And I think that it's easy to take things very personally when you are blaming the gun, because you are, in a way, casting aspersions on everybody who owns a firearm. And so I think we do have to be very careful about the language that we use around that, about pointing out, the root causes of domestic violence, that it's not just the guns. Even those statistics bear out that, it does create a much more dangerous situation. So that's one thing that I would just caution.
I think Bob Costas could have had a really great moment if you realized that he had a captive audience, mostly of men, to talk about the horrors of domestic violence and really raise that as an issue instead of, I think, very recklessly
ignore the element that takes domestic violence and makes it 12 times more likely to lead to somebody dying.
Yeah, let's talk about domestic violence.
That's right. Let's just ignore that.
All right. Up next, filmmaker Ken Burns looks back at a story Torrey says is both old and unfortunately new again.